Hello and welcome back to the HD podcast. I'm your host, Shashank Matu, reporting from Washington, D.C. Over the last few years, whenever I have had any conversations with Indian military officers or diplomats, there's one thing that I constantly hear, which is that China is India's biggest military and strategic threat. But it wasn't always like that. The two countries have at times been partners working on everything from trade to climate change. But over the past decade, China has changed. It has become more militarily aggressive abroad and more authoritarian at home. And it has become much more difficult for countries like India and the world to trust China. But could China change again? And this time for the better? Joining me to answer that question is Professor Rana Mittar of Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Mittar is, in my humble opinion, nothing less than one of the finest scholars of China alive today. Professor Mittar, you've argued that China can change, that it can actually live at peace with its neighbors as well as with the wider world. In short, you're arguing that another China is actually possible. But before we get to that, could you start us off with this? How did we get to this China? One that we see is repressive at home and increasingly aggressive abroad.
Shashank, first of all, a great pleasure to be here on the podcast with you, and a real pleasure to be able to have this conversation on some very, very important questions. Really looking forward to that. I would say that, yes, it's very important to understand how we've got to where we are today. And I would say that if you wanted to give a kind of quick two or three bullet point description of what China is today, I would say that compared to 10, 15 years ago, even, it's definitely more confident in the world. It has a sort of strong sense that it's rising in terms of global position, and it also has a strong perception that as America is rethinking its role, often in a very, very turbulent way, that provides an opportunity for China too. At the same time, I think China's also aware of its own vulnerabilities, particularly its economy, which at the moment is not in the strongest shape. So, in that sense, I think that this has often manifested itself in what can often seem like a pretty confrontational attitude towards the world. And we'll talk about why that might be, particularly, I suspect, in terms of the China India relationship as well. But let me just give one particular turning point, a moment that viewers might want to have in mind in terms of why this changed. Because the easy thing, and it's not wrong, is to say it's all about Xi Jinping. It's all about the current leader of China. He's been in power since 2012 and has only accumulated and grown the level of his personal power. Xi Jinping thought is now one of the driving characteristics of the way in which Chinese politics operates today. So Xi Jinping is obviously very important. But actually, I think it starts earlier. And I would say that a turning point moment, a trigger almost for this new world with a new China in it was back in 2008, nearly 2 decades ago, the global financial crisis. Now, in some ways, we're still living with the effects of that. But just to understand for a moment why for China it was such an important turning point, I would say that in the immediate aftermath of that moment when many Americans thought that the global economy might essentially be going down the drain, the coordination of central banks and the introduction of a new form, essentially, of quantitative easing in many parts of the West was echoed in China by the basically the sort of huge rush to credit and to issuing credit that will be spent on infrastructure. And the China that we think of today, the China where everyone has a smartphone in their hands and uses apps to pay to get around, to basically live their lives, where they ride on sleek subways, even in kind of smaller cities that many people have never heard of, amazing public transit, high speed rail, big skyscrapers, all of these things. They were really given rocket boosters by the aftermath of 2008, when China's answer was, let's use our financial resources to spend, reflate the economy, and basically find a way to improve our domestic situation and economy while pushing back against this global crisis. Now, I'll say that, as we'll go on to discuss, China is now paying the price for some of these choices, not least in a property sector that has actually, in some ways, really taken a downturn. But I think that 2008 moment was one where China started to say, in economics, in geopolitics, in culture, maybe we don't need to listen to what the Western world has to say anymore. Now we're going to take it our way. And I think that we're still seeing the effects of that with Xi Jinping's China today.
Right. Could I ask you about that question of this much sharper view of the world? When I've had conversations with Chinese scholars who've come in, which has been harder and harder over the last couple of years because of the relationship that India and China have had, a lot of their view is very black and white when it comes to the India-China relationship. They say that you have a very close relationship with America. You have essentially aligned with the West against us, and therefore you are a strategic competitor. And therefore, we see it as necessary to put pressure on the border, or, for example, to supply Pakistan arms. That's, of course, a very specific example of India. But you see that mirrored across the region, where you've had tensions with the Philippines, tensions with Japan, South Korea has had its concerns, and of course India is just one of the more extreme examples of countries coming to blows with China. Could you dwell a little bit more on this idea of China becoming more aggressive internationally, having a much more black and white view of its neighbors, who it sometimes sees as opponents?
Well, I will answer the question, of course, Shashank, but I want to point out that you and I are speaking just, a couple of weeks after an astonishing photo opportunity where Prime Minister Modi was in Tianjin at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, essentially close up and smiling with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin of Russia. So I think we're living in an era where geopolitical assumptions are often being overturned quite rapidly. And I would say that one of the reasons for that move by the Prime Minister was, I think, at least in the recent short term, a perception that the United States is not acting towards India as expected in terms of partnership. So things can move quite fast. But the bigger macro question you're asking, I think, is absolutely one we have to address. I think it's fair to say that when you are talking to Chinese analysts of India, and there are a considerable number, and many of them are very, very expert on the country, they will tend to pivot towards security questions. I will gently suggest that might be because, in many, many cases, when Indian interlocutors are speaking to the Chinese, it is usually those same security questions they'll go to first. And I'd say, in some ways, the level of proportionality about the seriousness of the breach is one that's felt even more strongly in India than in China, by which I mean the ghost of 1962, the Sino-Indian War, again, really a turning point moment when what had been relatively warm relationship between Nehru's India and Mao's China, certain amount of cooperation on science, on economics, on development, turned into all-out war on the border, and ever since then the relationship has never really recovered. But that clash, I think, lives much more broadly and takes up much more space in Indian strategic minds than it does in Chinese strategic minds. That's partly because China has so many other countries that it is essentially thinking about at the same time in terms of its own forward policy. The United States, much of Southeast Asia, Japan, and aside from Pakistan, really India has only China that sits in that particular situation. So I think that there's a question of proportionately how much each side is thinking about the other. And I would say that because India doesn't, I mean, to be really direct about it, India doesn't occupy as much of the headspace of Chinese thinkers as perhaps China does in the minds of Indian security thinkers. When they're asked questions, it pretty much pivots straight back to, well, this is our problem with you. I'd say it's also linked to the fact that, if I may, when Chinese visitors are in India, they're probably going to be pretty much playing for their own home team. In other words, this is not always an environment in which having a kind of quiet, private conversation where you discuss nuance and complexity is really going to happen very easily. I think that happens perhaps more often in kind of third spaces where neither side feels that they're on the other's territory. Now, Singapore is a very good example of a place where a lot of people go in Asia to have those sorts of difficult conversations. So I would say if I were going to, try and explain the wider context of that sort of confrontational language, and it's very real, of course, is that in some ways, China, because of its history over the last 100 years, let's say, acts today as if it was still the relatively weak, bullied country that it was in the 1920s and 1930s, even though in the 2020s, it's one of the strongest countries in the world. And I think it's the difficulties, and actually the difficulty of the mindset of a country that is actually objectively very, very strong in security terms, but acts like one that feels that it's still that weak country of an earlier era. And getting China past that perception is a task, I think, for the whole global community to undertake.
Understood. Professor Mehta, let me close out what we were talking about this China by citing something that you wrote, where you said that in fact there are many constituencies inside China today. You talked about people in think tanks, people who are journalists, people in business, who are actually quite despairing about the atmosphere in China today. That there is more repression at home, there is more aggression abroad. Could you talk a little bit about that? Where are those sources of dissatisfaction? What exactly are they dissatisfied about when they talk about China's trajectory?
I would say that if we're talking about the class of people, kind of middle class, urban, who work in what you might call sort of information society, that could be academics, finance, media, and so forth, there are a variety of sources of dissatisfaction. And yeah, I think they are real. One of the major underlying ones is the economy. I think if you ask pretty much any younger middle class person today, say aged in their 20s or 30s, they will say that they are the first generation, at least the first generation in half a century in China, which cannot expect to have a better lifestyle than their parents. For a very long time, the China that we're talking about now repressed political debate, but said that the reward that you'll get for obeying those rules is that you get a better middle class lifestyle, we'll build more houses, provide better jobs. That bargain, a lot of middle class people today feel, is not being upheld. That economic reality then links to a wider sense that in other areas, people feel dissatisfied about freedom more generally speaking. It's not, I think, inevitably the case that just because someone feels well off, they're willing to sacrifice freedom. But to be honest, an economically better off place is more likely to be successful in getting people to keep their mouths shut. When the economy is not doing well and people are being told, well, actually, you can't talk about this, you can't talk about other things that trouble you, that leads them to a situation where they're just not sure whether or not actually they feel confident in the system as a whole. So, for instance, embarrassing economic statistics about youth unemployment in China have no longer been permitted for kind of publication because I think the authorities feel that they're simply too high, and that this will give the wrong impression to the population about what's going on. But the problem is that people know that youth unemployment is real, even if they're not seeing it in the statistics. And that sort of factor of uncertainty, that inability to actually be able to gather data and to analyze it, to talk about what's happening in China, for the kind of people for whom information and its processing is a living, is a really difficult thing to live with. People in media, for instance, who 15, 20 years ago, even under China's very strict regulations, could do real investigative journalism. They could look at social evils. They could, look at what was happening in the countryside and talk about how there was huge inequality there. They could talk about, environmental issues. These things are mostly either off limits or only reportable in very restrictive ways. And that, again, for ambitious middle class people who maybe want to make a contribution to society, more broadly speaking, that atmosphere is quite depressing.
Right. And you, I think, argued very impressively in one of your latest pieces that, in fact, a different China is possible. You've argued that actually a there is a turning point. You mentioned that there was one turning point 15, 20 years ago where China basically decided that, look, our social system, our economic system is superior to many others. Our power is rising. And like any other rising power, we can push countries around. We've seen the impact of that in its relationship with India as well. But you're saying now that a different turning point could be arriving, and that turning point could lead to the rise of a different China that is actually at peace with the West, is at peace with its neighbors like India. What exactly is that other China?
And actually, I would add to that, Shashank, at peace with itself. So I'll explain what I mean by that. First of all, well, thanks very much for your kind words about the piece. It's available in the Journal of Foreign Affairs, so everyone wants to read it. I would say that one of the overall long term things that one should note in trying to predict what will happen in China is that when it changes very fast. Even on a time scale of looking at every 20 years, 20 years ago, China and the US were still quite close. China was entering the World Trade Organization. Today, they're pretty much, adversaries, certainly on trade and to some extent on security as well. 40 years before that, China was very close to the Soviet Union. 20 years before that, China was in the middle of World War II. So, in all those situations, you can see that even just a couple of decades makes a big difference. And that's why I'm saying if we look into the medium term, I'm not talking about next week or even next year, but maybe a couple of decades from now, and as much as we can make any reasonable prediction, we can certainly predict that we don't know how it will turn out. But we can look to the recent past for some clues. And one of the things that we forget, because recent years under Xi Jinping have been much more restricted and constrained in terms of personal freedoms, is that even under China's current system, actually there were periods that were much more liberal, relatively speaking. Now, we're not talking here about the kind of freedom of speech that you would get in an electoral democracy, but we are talking about freer journalism, social media that was much less restricted, the ability to complain about the government more openly, even if you couldn't do anything about it. You couldn't, call for an election; that would still be illegal. But certainly, people could complain about what was going on, and a general feeling that actually there was a sort of public square, a public sphere in which people could talk about difficult issues. If China had that system, 20 years ago, or that capacity 20, 25 years ago, there's no particular reason why it couldn't have it today. And I think that even if it's not likely to happen today, in a few years' time, I wouldn't bet against, in particular, the next generation of Chinese leaders whose youth, whose teenage years were spent not like Xi Jinping and his peers during the Cultural Revolution when China was turned upside down, but actually in the 1980s, a time when China's youth were encouraged to turn towards the West and America and learn from the West to try and change China. That didn't mean that the Chinese communist system was going to go away or that it was going to dissolve itself, but it did mean that they understood the importance of more openness. And I would say that looking towards actually a system that takes advantage of that new generation coming through and a changing global atmosphere, which actually is willing to listen to China on lots of issues like energy transition, for instance, that might provide the basis for a more open China, probably within the existing party system, but with more freedom to actually talk about real issues.
Right. And something very interesting that you mentioned actually during your conversation about where China is going and how it could change is also that China could actually take a page out of other countries' books, like for example, India. That India, for example, does a lot of things like on the international sphere. It's able to work with the West, it's able to work with Russia as well, but it does not announce its intention to upturn the global international order. And China is a much harder country to understand, much more inscrutable that way. And because of that, it generates a lot of resistance, and that China could need to change that. Could you talk about that a little bit as well?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that has characterized, I'd say in a sense, it's characterized Indian foreign policy ever since independence, but certainly is notable in the last few years and decades, is its ability to be very, very flexible in its affiliation. So, during much of the Cold War, India remained really the only major, democratic state to maintain a pretty warm partnership with the Soviet Union. And that, of course, disconcerted many people in the West, but it was a sign that India was capable of turning its orientations in different directions. Even now, of course, the relationship between India and Russia is closer than many in the West would necessarily appreciate. But at the same time, this has not stopped India from actually developing, as the Chinese complain, a strong relationship with the United States, security pact through the Quad, and other elements that suggest that actually India is able to find those sort of different kind of nodes and engage with them. One other one we mentioned earlier, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which of course puts it closer to China as well. I think that China could learn from that particular model. I think it would be difficult for China directly to emulate it because essentially China has its own set of aspirations about ways in which its global influence is going to grow. And I would say that some of those do involve a much more direct sense of confrontation, whether on economic terms or whether on security terms, with the United States in particular. China regards the United States as a rival. The United States certainly regards China as a rival and indeed as an adversary in many cases. So, in that context, it's harder, I think, for China simply to sort of step back from that position and develop a position of neutrality and still gain the outcomes that it wants. It does see, I think, a sort of zero sum type outcome in a variety of areas where, to give a specific example, if it is able to push forward Chinese 5G communications and network technology to emerging global South actors, then it means that almost certainly any American sponsored equivalent will not be taken up because countries don't install 5G twice in most cases. The first mover gets the advantage. India, I think, is not so much at the moment in the position of having those kinds of global public goods to offer, and therefore the confrontation that India has to, or the choices that India has to make, are less immediately urgent in that sense. But I think it is fair to say that at its best, Indian diplomacy over the decades has been quite good at trying to understand, not least through institutions like the non-aligned movement, how it can engage with other countries that have their own sensitivities, you know, post-colonial history, economic kind of inequalities, a whole variety of things that make it difficult often to run a polity. China is in general not even at this point that good about empathizing with the internal politics of countries that are not like China, and frankly, no country is really directly like China. So I think learning those sorts of qualities in Beijing would be a worthwhile exercise. We have to wait and see whether actually that is something that is in train at the moment or not.
Could I ask you, Professor? I think that this is an important point, and I want to focus one question at least on this, which is about this prospect of another China, a country that is much more at peace at home and with its neighbors like India and as well with the United States. Basically, if I understood your argument correctly, you said that, look, a different generation of leaders could come to power within the next 15 to 20 years that remember a time when China was much more open to the West, much more open to the world, much more at peace with itself as well, and they will want to return China to that sort of stage. You also say that China could also move into a spot where the world is moving towards more authoritarianism, less liberal democracies. And so China, which is again an authoritarian system at home, will feel less threatened about that and therefore less insecure about its place in the world. This is an interesting argument precisely because a China that is more at peace with its neighbors is a very good thing for India, particularly because of the challenges we've seen on the border over the last 5 years. So let me ask you this question. How likely do you think it is that China makes that transition? If you were a betting man, how much would you bet on China making that transition into a country that is more at peace with its neighbors like India, as well as with countries like America?
I think that it is quite likely that, okay, let me try and get to this sort of portion. I think that there's a high degree of likelihood that China will find itself in that position because it helps with probably what is the absolute key goal of the party and the government as a whole, which is to make sure that they maintain an unbroken hold on power. And to do that, I think they've realized in the last few years more than ever, you have to have a strong economy. And it would be, it's not unknown, but it's unusual for countries that have very bad relationships with nearby neighbors and with kind of major trading partners to be able to maintain the economy in a fit state, because you have problems with, you know, broken supply chains, with a feeling maybe of unreliability, which means that people don't want to invest, a feeling that there's you know, a kind of randomness about policy that people don't necessarily want to engage with. And China in the past, because it's been very opaque in terms of its intentions, particularly when it comes to, say, you know, foreign firms, or you know, how it deals with the neighbors, has really kind of suffered in a self-inflicted wound from that particular tendency. I think that because the economic problems are becoming urgent, not in the sense that I think that they're existential. I don't think China's economy is going to collapse at all, but I do think that it's clearer and clearer to the leadership that it is not firing on all cylinders and probably won't do for some time. In that context, keeping the economy, or improving the quality of the economy, to try and maintain a stronger sense that the party should be and will remain in charge, becomes a top priority. That means avoiding confrontation in areas where essentially the outcome is unpredictable. That might mean a border conflict with India, probably more likely in terms of where China's priorities lie, the question of whether or not to squeeze Taiwan further, which of course remains in priority terms, probably much higher on the list than India as a current issue. I think that at the moment the tendencies point towards that more economics driven attempt to try and improve things. But that having been said, we also see that there is, you know, a huge investment in the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, particularly its naval and its air force capacity. And so you can't cut out the possibility that actually this is being done with the purpose of essentially strengthening China's position if in fact the economic track doesn't work out and it ends up being a question of a security crisis of a serious nature in East Asia. We haven't had a kind of existential one of those really since, I suppose, the Vietnam War in the 1970s. But the fact that we haven't had it for nearly half a century is not a guarantee that we will never have it. And I suspect that we're moving towards a more dangerous rather than a less dangerous period on that front.
Right. And you argue, I think, very interestingly, where you say that, look, if you want this new China, if China wants to be more secure and more at peace with the world and wants to be a dominant power, the use of military force against neighbors like, against Taiwan and against neighbors like India is precisely the wrong sort of strategy to follow. So if I could ask you very quickly to explain your strategy or your logic on that.
Yeah, I'll try to just do it as concisely as possible. I mean, essentially, a China which is seen as being willing to use military force, use the capacity of its huge armed forces, I think by definition will just be less trusted in the region because however much other countries want to trade with China, and they do, worrying about whether or not actually China's potential military actions are actually going to lead to actual military actions, particularly when there have been examples of that happening, will shake investor confidence. It will shake the willingness of actors to be involved in, supply chains that are sunk very deep and then are hard to change at short notice. It will make it harder to make a bet on China in economic terms in that sense. And I think that's one of the reasons that in this particular case, fomenting a war of any sort in their own backyard actually would be very counterproductive from China's point of view.
Exactly. Could I ask you, Professor, one question that I've always had, like thinking about China, is the fact that China, as you pointed out again in your piece, has difficulty crafting a narrative that appeals to a lot of countries. We are surrounded, for example, by Western culture, Western thinking. The politics of the United States, for example, is open and understandable to vast countries in the world. But with China, I genuinely believe that most people around the world would have a job of identifying the members of the Politburo Standing Committee. The intricacies of Chinese culture, society are much more difficult for the world to understand. And if when we don't understand something, we tend to grow suspicious of it. And that is one of those things that you identify as one of the problems that China has if it wants to become a rising power or a great power, which is just that its narrative is unclear and the appeal of China's rise is a little harder to understand. Could you talk a little bit about that, about China's lack of a narrative as such?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that, in a sense, prevents China from becoming a more powerful international actor is that it still hasn't worked out a clear and consistent story to tell about itself. There are a lot of phrases, often quite sort of jargon driven, community of common destiny or global development initiative, or I think the most recent one is global governance initiative. But these are sort of phraseologies. And when you look at the detail, they either say things which actually are, not particularly original ideas. For instance, there ought to be a more multipolar world as opposed to a world dominated by one hegemon, or kind of fairly bland statements that no one would really disagree with, like economic development is very important and everyone should encourage it, which doesn't really tell you very much. I mention this because this struggle has not been the case in China always. In terms of the narrative, if you think back just half a century, there was a brief but actually very intense period when China managed to come up with a very successful narrative at home, which translated abroad, and that was Maoism. I mean, even now there still are people who would perhaps term themselves Naxalites in India, of course, Shashank, and the ideological origins of Naxalism lie in revolutionary Maoism. That's also true of the Shining Path movement out in Peru, which was suppressed, a couple of decades ago, but certainly for a long time drew on Mao as its inspiration. Even in the streets of, Paris in the 1960s, Mao became this sort of inspiring figure for a lot of students who probably didn't know that much about what he actually advocated. In other words, it's not that communist China was incapable of creating a narrative that somehow would catch the moment. The difficulty this time round is that I think that there is too much of a gap between what China wants to do at home in terms of narrative and what it wants to do abroad. The reason being, at home, the narrative concentrates, I mean, again, I'm simplifying greatly, but first of all, on pushing the idea of Xi Jinping as a sort of central leader on a kind of personal basis, which obviously is an idea that doesn't really translate outside China, and also a sort of continuing struggle between a Marxist background a kind of willingness to revive Confucian tradition in the kind of traditional philosophical way, and the question of how that mixes into a modern China. That's a very important internal debate within China. I don't think many people in Zambia or Indonesia or Peru care about it all that much, though. So until there is the capacity really to take those internal debates, which Maoism was also one in the past, and make them into something that actually really resonates with people's feelings in the outside world, I think China will struggle on a narrative. It may be that they pick up a hook that's something to do with, and this is my guess, the way in which technology can enable economic development and also authoritarianism. I think they're going to try and make, in a way, if I may use a sort of kind of a shorthand for this, they're going to try and make their authoritarian tendencies trendy in a sense. But I think they've got quite a long path to go before they can actually make that land.
Right. Professor Mitra, I know you have to go, so I'll ask you one final question. I will abuse my privileges here and combine two questions into one, which is basically you've pointed out that there could be a different China, another China that is much more capable of working with countries like India, like America, much more at peace with the world. Could I ask you, could China also get worse in the coming decades? What will that look like? And if I could just also ask you, how do countries like India deal with the China that we see on our northern border? What are we going to get? What exactly should we be looking out for? How exactly do we build or not build that relationship with China?
So I think yes, it's clear that it could get worse as the world gets worse as well. I think that my very short answer would be that any situation in which China goes to war would be a worse situation than now, and not just worse for the rest of the world. That's obviously true, but worse for China as well. Societies at war are less peaceful, less happy, less prosperous than societies that are at peace. So that's the very very important distinction. In terms of India dealing with China, I think there are several things to say. First is actually might sound counterintuitive, but India needs to learn a lot more about China, and that probably means actually having more, not less, dialogue with China. It's still, as you were indicating this before, often quite difficult for Chinese to get into India. Think tankers, policy people, whatever, to talk. It's not so difficult the other way. I think quite a few Indians get into China, and visa regulations are not that strict. Whereas the other way around, coming into India, it is pretty strict. Well, that's probably going to have to be dealt with because at some point you need to have longer and stronger conversations with China, not least because it's harder to tell people where you disagree with them if you don't look them in the face. And that also, I think, gets people away from that very defensive atmosphere that you mentioned before of when India says, "Why are you doing this?" China says, "Because we want to," or it sounds confrontational on that front. I think there are also areas where India is going to have to make some tough decisions, but they're important for its next stage of decision of development. And I'd say I'd focus in on just one, and that's technology. Most of the Indian tech entrepreneurs I speak to, many of whom are involved in, say, software and services and so forth, say that despite the, very, very difficult political situation between the two countries, it's still impossible for India's tech sector to progress in the short term without some aspect of Chinese technology, components, parts, and so forth. And overcoming that difficulty, I think, is going to be crucial. My guess is that it involves India developing much, much more indigenous production capacity and spending a lot more. And again, money will be involved in research and development and developing its own capacities. But at the same time, I think that it is clearly the case that China has a variety of areas in terms of market, in terms of technological capability that India is going to have to draw on at least for some period of time, and working out how to do that in a safe and secure manner. It's a dilemma, but that's one of the ones which I think needs to be grappled with rather than shoved under the carpet.
Understood. Professor Rana Mitter of Harvard Kennedy School, thank you so much for joining us on the HT podcast.
Thanks, Shashank. It's been a real pleasure.